The First Journal of Simon Fraser. Chapter 2. Rocky Mountain Portage to McLeod Lake. Tuesday, May 20th. Early in the morning took an account of all the property remaining at this place, Rocky Mountain Portage, and closed this transactions of the year, and after I had finished writing my public and private letters, we settled the canoe for below to be off at manned by 5 men, and Mr. Stuart and I crossed the river with them, after which they departed at 3 p.m. Previous to our departure. All the people that goes above with us crossed the river with the large canoe, previous to its being loaded, as there are no other large canoes at the fort to cross in after it is off. Mr. Archibald McGillivray, who has the fort in charge, remains with only Bason's family until the return of Bason from Dunvegan, which I expect will be very soon. It was 10 o'clock at night when we got to the upper end of the Portage. The road is amazing bad, and the Portage is at least 14 or 15 miles long. Wednesday, May 21st. Fine weather. Wakened all hands early to prepare the canoes and everything else to be off in the afternoon. But on account of one of the canoes, the one from Trout McLeod Lake, being small, and our having a quantity of fresh meat over, enough to conduct us to Finley's Branch, we could not embark all on board the 2 canoes without being too heavily loaded. Therefore I set Lamalis and 2 others to arrange another canoe that had remained here since last summer. Lamalis appears to slur it so that we will set off from here with 3 men and canoes. About sunset Mr. Stuart and I took our departure with 2 canoes and encamped at the first point. Lamalis will follow tomorrow as soon as the canoe will be arranged. Mr. Stuart's canoe made a great deal of water, and is so rude and ill-made that they were every moment in danger of oversetting it, for which reason we will be obliged to pass a couple of days at this place to arrange it. It is the worst made that ever I saw, and is more like a trough than a canoe, and I am surprised how Mr. McDougall, who was present, would allow such a one to be made. It would be more easy to make a new one than to arrange it. Mr. Stuart takes the courses and charts of the river. Thursday, May 22nd. Fine weather. Early in the morning part of the people were sent for wood to make Varang's ribs, while the others took all the wood out of the canoe and gummed it properly inside. The bars were likewise taken out, and others more long, put in their place, after which it was sebarded with varangs not so round as the others that were there before, which with properly gumming it outside kept all hands bussy all day, so that we could not be off until 9 p.m. However, as we marched late, we came to our first encampment of last fall, where we put ashore for the night, distance about 7 miles. Notwithstanding all possible pains were taken to gum and arrange Mr. Stuart's canoe, it still leaks so much water that several things got wet. This is the new canoe that Lamalis made at Trout McLeod Lake. It is not only ill-made, but the bark is very bad. I have the canoe I came off with from Lac La Pluie last summer, which is not much better than the other. It was a good canoe, but got much spoiled last fall in the ice at Trout Lake, and afterwards going down to the Portage, and I could not get it renewed this spring for the want of a canoe-maker. Indeed, Mr. Stuart would have made it, but it was at the upper end of the Portage, and he had too much to do at the fort to leave it for such a time as would be required to renew the canoe. Friday, May 23rd. Fine warm weather. We were obliged to gum both canoes this morning before we set off, having arrived too late last night to perform that operation. A strong headwind all day. At noon we were obliged to put ashore to gum, the canoes being so leaky that we could not prevent the property from getting wet. Here we lost 4 hours, and yet we were obliged to put ashore and encamp, about an hour before sunset to gum again, in order to be off early in the morning. Little Gervais, who steers Mr. Stuart's canoe, is not able to keep it straight. Indeed, the want of a steerman will greatly retard our progress up this strong current. The water was rather low when we left the Portage, but is now rising faster. However, though we seldom make use of the paddles, the bottom being good, it is good going by the pole. Saturday, May 24th. We set off early, but gummed both the canoes in the course of the day. In the afternoon, La Malise overtook Us, and we encamped all together. He has been pretty expeditious. The computed distance of this day is only 12 miles. The canoes are so very bad, and so poorly managed, one of them having a middleman to steer it, that we cannot advance much. Sunday, May 25th, set off early, and soon after came to the foot of the strongest rapid we saw yet. The canoes were towed up with the line, but one of them struck upon a stem which broke a small hole in the bottom, and it took us near an hour to repair it. Afterwards, we gummed the 3 canoes, which operation took upwards of 2 hours. We came to an encampment at a little river that falls into the main on the right side, and gummed all the canoes again. Monday, May 26th. Fine weather. The sun was up when we left our encampment, and shortly after we came to a strong rapid. The knight, Sir Alexander Mackenzie, mentions his being obliged to make a portage of 400 yards to pass it. But if so, the water must have been considerable lower than at present, for we found a fine passage along the shore on the right, and had the water been higher, it would have been still better. We towed up the canoes with the line, but one of them got a little damaged, which took but a short time to repair. But we were afterwards obliged to gum it, which made us lose a considerable time. At one of my encampments of last fall, I was surprised to find upwards of a foot of snow in the place of my tent. The mountains are all covered with snow, but it is chiefly dissolved near the banks of the river, and it is not a little curious at this late period of the season to see snow drifting on the top of the mountains, which are of no great height, while we are scorching with heat on the banks of the river. We encamped about sunset and gummed all the canoes. May 26th continued. The canoes are so very bad that though we had upwards of a keg on leaving the portage, that we soon got out of gum, and are now obliged to gather for daily use. Here we overtook a band of meadow Indians who are on their way to the beaver country beyond Finlay's branch. La Malise killed a reindeer that was crossing the river. For this we may thank one of the Indians' dogs that chased it and brought it to the riverside. Previous to our arrival at the Indians, we were greatly amused looking at some of the Indians running after the wild sheep, which they call aspa. They are really expert, indeed, running full speed among the perpendicular rocks, which, had I not ocular demonstrations, I could never believe to have been trained by any creature, either of the human or brute creation, for the rocks appeared to Us, which perhaps might be exaggerated a little from the distance, to be as steep as a wall, and yet, while in pursuit of the sheep, the Indians bounded from one to another with the swiftness of a roe, and at last killed 2 in their snares, one of which we traded for ammunition merely for a rarity. They have great resemblance to the European sheep. The wool is almost as fine, perfectly white, and upwards of 6 inches long, and when fat the Indians represent the flesh as excellent eating. At present time it is meagre, it is rather tough, and has a strong musk taste and smell. Tuesday, May 7th. Fine warm weather. The water rises very fast. Indeed, it has risen upwards of 3 feet since we left the portage, and though the Curry rent is amazing strong, it is exceedingly good going as yet. We came to and encamped at the last rapid, which is about 2 miles below the forks on Finlay's branch. La Malise, who was before us, attempted to ascend this rapid with the pole, but Mr. Stuart, who was the nearest to him, called to him to desist, and I gave him a set down for risking the property so much where it was not necessary. It was really difficult to come up this rapid, and we were obliged to take out the load and carry it over a rocky point of 400 yards, and the canoes was taken up light. Had the water been lower, we could have gone up easily loaded, and had it been higher, We could effect the same thing by a safe passage along the right shore that at present contains only water enough to take up the canoe's light. La Malisse, who was first up, left his canoe with only the bow of it on shore, and while he was busy at the lower end, it went off and ran down the rapid. It received, however, no injury, and they went for it with another canoe. I was much displeased with La Malisse on this occasion, and as well as his attempting to go up with a full load, and threatened him severely if he was not more careful in the future. It was after dark before everything was carried to the upper end of the Portage, and of course the canoes could not be gummed, which will make us go off late tomorrow. Several of the Indians followed us until within a short distance of our encampment. We marched today by Mr. Stuart's calculation 19 miles, which is the greatest distance we have done yet in a day. At this place he lost his book of memorandum, having wrapped it up in his cloak, and left it on the rock while he went to help the people that were taking up the canoes. The line got entangled in the cloak without anyone perceiving it, and on the men's pulling it, the cloak with the contents flew into the river. The cloak was saved, but the memorandum perished, and the compass was near sharing the same fate. Wednesday, May 28th. Still fine weather. It was 9 o'clock before the canoes could be prepared to be off. In the morning, Pousse-Coupe's comrade came to us with a couple of Indians that never saw white people before. They are exceedingly well clothed in leather, and though they never were at the fort, they have guns which they got from their relations. They are the relations of the meadow chief, but of a different family. They gave us some information about their lands. What information we got from these Indians is chiefly about Finlay's branch and the country beyond it, which is conformable to what we have heard from the other Indians at the Portage. The only additional information we got from them is that there is an immense number of beaver all along Finlay's branch and the river that falls into it, and that there are a few caribou about what they call the Bear Lake. They seem to be well acquainted with the carriers, with whom they live in amity, and from whom I imagine they got the most part of their ironworks and ornaments. At least they are of the same kind. They desired us to be on our guard, and beware of the Attah, which is the name both them and the big men gives the Atna tribe, whom they represent as more treacherous than really wicked, and who would likely, if not aware, shoot their arrows at us. By what we could understand from these Indians, as well as the others whom we saw at the Portage, nothing can be more erroneous than what Sir Alexander Mackenzie reports that it was the near branch of the Peace River he followed. The Indians consider the western branch always as the main. It is more than twice as large as the eastern branch, and does not terminate so soon. On the contrary, the source of the east branch is comparatively near at hand, of which I will take notice afterwards, but Mackenzie seems to have been ambitious of having traced the Peace River to its source as well as confluence. This is not the only mistake he seems to have committed. Whether designedly or not, I cannot say, but this I can affirm, that from the Portage to Finlay's branch, and which I contend to be the main branch of the Peace River, we had few of the difficulties he mentions to have encountered. The navigation is not only safe but as easy as in the lower part of the Peace River, and I have often had more difficulty during the high water coming up there with 3 men than here. The distance does not appear to be much above 90 or 100 miles at most, and a canoe well manned might have performed it in 3 days, as the water is now in the long days. And had our canoes been anywise good, even with 3 men, we would have performed it in 5. And as for the water, and I am sure we have been as much in it as him, we have not felt it more cold than in other parts of the country, which makes me inclined to believe that he has exaggerated all along. But then he was the first that passed, and it was pardonable in him, and I have not the least desire to detract from his merits. His perseverance was commendable, and he succeeded where perhaps many others would have failed. We traded with the Indians that came with Pousse-Coupe's comrade, and made them a present of 10 balls and a little powder. We informed them of there being a fort established at Trout Lake, to which place they promised to go in the course of the summer, it being nearer their lands and was farther out of reach of their enemies, the Beaver Indians, than the Rocky Mountain Portage. We left the main branch on the west and entered the other on the east at 11 a.m., which is overflown, and the current was so very strong that it was with much difficulty we could advance. No use can be made of the poles on account of the depth of the water, excepting sometimes against the banks and driftwood, and the current runs with such velocity that it cannot be stemmed with 3 paddles, and not easily with 4, for we often help them ourselves, and the banks are so thickly interwoven with trees and shrubs that it is seldom they can be approached, so that there is no method left except that of going up by pulling the branches, and the canoes are in continual danger of being broke to pieces by the driftwood. Killed a swan in the course of the day and encamped late. Having finished the remainder of our fresh meat, gave all hands wherewith to sup of dried meat. The men very much fatigued, and some of them are very near giving up. Thursday, May 29th. Fine weather. The water still rising, and wood continually drifting down the river. My canoe was very near being cut in 2. 2 of B.G. Rivard's dogs were lost, they not being able to follow the canoe. We saw several beaver in the course of the day, and came to and encamped at sunset upon a bank of gravel opposite my first encampment last fall in this river, which I consider as a good day. Indeed, the current was less strong than yesterday. As the men force much in this river, we allow them to make 3 meals a day, and as they eat all together out of the same bag of pemmican, we put ashore for that purpose, and afterwards it is laid aside and not touched until next meal. This we find to be the best saving way, and the men are better off and better pleased than if they ate a little at every pipe. Friday, May 30th. Fine weather. We set off at 4:30 a.m., but at the second pipe a stump seine ran through my canoe, which obliged us to put ashore, and we lost 2 hours to repair and gum it. In the forenoon, Mr. Stuart's canoe made so much water that they were obliged to put ashore to gum it, which operation took up 2 hours. During that interval, Mr. Stuart had an observation for latitude. We encountered more misery today than any day yet, and were obliged to cut several logs and embarrassed to open a passage. My canoe, through the awkwardness of the Portage, was very much endangered, and every soul on board near perishing. In the afternoon we passed a strong rapid, at a point which gave us much trouble to ascend, on account of the rocks being perpendicular, and no bottom for the poles. We were obliged to send down the line by tying a stick to it, which was caught by the man in the bow of the canoe, in which manner all the canoes were towed up one after the other with a half-load, and the rest of the loads were carried over a rocky point off about 200 yards, encamped about 1.5 miles above the rapid on an island. The computed distance of this day is only 8.5 miles, and yet all hands worked hard all day. Saturday, May 31st. Fine weather, but rather cold. In the morning at the second pipe, my canoe broke upon a stump, and it required 2 hours to mend and gum it, and before noon the same accident happened to Mr. Stuart's, and it took up 3 hours to repair it. We encamped at sunset upon a high bank about 5 miles below the prairie. This day's progress was only 11 miles. Sunday, June 1st. The weather was rather cold in the morning, but afterwards exceeding warm. Indeed, I never saw such a changeable climate. At one moment we are shivering with cold, and the next scorching with heat. The water begins to lower, and there is but very little wood drifting. But we had the worst going of any day as yet, owing to the strength of the current, the depth of the water, and the badness of the canoes. In the forenoon, La Malise broke his canoe and put ashore to mend it, with the intention of being off immediately. But as soon as the canoe was taken out of the water, St. Pierre fainted, and remained speechless upward on an hour, which induced La Malise to bond his canoe, thinking to have done before St. Pierre recovered, which made us lose upwards of 3 hours. My canoe was also gummed, and I can say with truth it was much in want of it. Stuart was ahead at the time, and we overtook him at the prairie waiting for us. We came to an encampment after sunset, about 2 miles below River aux Nations. The computed distance of today is only 10 miles, which to me appeared very long. Monday, June 2nd. Fine day. Exceedingly bad going until we passed the River aux Nations, which is a fine navigable river on the right, and so called because the upper part of it is inhabited by some of the big men, though of a different family from those at Trout Lake, after which the current slackened a little. Here we left one of the canoes and separated its load on the other two, on account of all the men being nearly exhausted with fatigue, and especially Lagarde, who steered my canoe since the 26th of last month, has such a sore wrist that he is no more able to. La Malice, who served in that capacity since the Portage, undertakes to steer it to Trout Lake, and I expect to go on better by having all hands on board the two canoes. Hitherto we were not able to embark all in the two canoes, but now that all the fresh meat and 3 pieces of dried provisions are consumed, we will not be much embarrassed. Indeed, it is not the load entirely that prevented us leaving a canoe sooner, but considering the crazy state they are in it, would be risking our own lives and the property to attempt to load them anywise to come up such strong and rapidious current. Chiefly by pulling on the branches, we came to and encamped opposite a small island at the distance of 11 miles from our encampment of last night. In the evening, the weather was cloudy, and all appearances of rain, and before we went to bed it began a small drizzling rain, which continued the most part of the night. Tuesday, June 3rd. It rained in the morning, which prevented our setting off until 7:30 a.m. Indeed, it did not displease me to have a pretext to indulge the people with a little rest, which they stood much in need of. Several showers fell through the day. At 1 p.m. we put ashore to gum the canoes at my 3rd encampment of last year, where we took up 2 hours. We encamped a little before sunset on account of my canoe being broke in the side, having struck against an embarrass. Both canoes have become so heavy and shattered that they cannot be taken out of the water by less than 4 men. Today's distance is 1112 miles, Wednesday, June 4th. Several showers of rain and hail fell in course of the day. All hands were busy engaged about 3 hours gumming Mr. Stuart's canoe, which leaked so much that the pieces could not be kept from getting wet. Encamped within an hour of sunset. Distance 5 miles. Thursday, June 5th. Several showers of rain and hail, notwithstanding we set off early, but about 8 a.m. As our progress was very slow and the cur rent so amazing strong, we unloaded each of the canoes of 9 pieces in order to go more expeditiously and get to the entrance of the small river today, and to send down a canoe immediately on our arrival to bring the pieces left behind. We encamped at 6 p.m., about 2 miles up the Pack River that leads to Trout Lake. Notwithstanding the fact that the Pack River that leads to this place, Trout Lake, is a considerable large and navigable river in all seasons, it does not appear to have been noticed by Sir Alexander Mackenzie, as he used to indulge himself sometimes with a little sleep. Likely he did not see it, and I can account for many other omissions in no other manner than his being asleep at the time he pretends to have been very exact, but was qualified to make observations, and were I inclined to find fault with him, I could prove that he seldom or ever paid the attention he pretends to have done, and that many of his remarks were not made by himself, but communicated by his men. It is certainly difficult to stem the current of the east branch during the high water, but not near so much as he makes it. There is scarcely a point in it, but a canoe with 6 paddles would go up with ease, and if we had so much difficulty, it is not so much owing to the difficulty of the navigation itself as to the badness of the canoes and the awkwardness of the bouts, particularly steersmen. A canoe well manned might come from Finlay's branch to the entrance of the Pack River that leads to Trout Lake the 5th day with ease. On our entering the east branch, there was a very perceptible change in the climate, and the vegetation was far advanced, whereas as below Finlay's branch on the Peace River the trees did not begin to bud, I suppose owing to the vicinity of the mountains, but along this river they are at a great distance and often out of sight. The banks of the river and the country in general appears to be low and in every place marshy, and there is a great deal of beaver marks all along, and we saw the tracks of large animals in many places, as likewise we observed some jays of a sky colour, but no other birds that are not common in the Peace River. We likewise saw a vast quantity of the Canadian balsam trees all along. The first we perceived was at Finale's branch, and in the vicinity of Trout Lake, which is small but which has a water communication with others more large beyond in a southern direction. There is plenty of hemlock and some of the servant tree, but with the exception for the bois piquant, we saw no other tree or shrubs except such as are common in the Peace River. The elder, however, is more large, there being some of 4 feet in circumference. The distance from our last encampment to the little river is computed at 15 miles. Friday, June 6th. It rained all last night and this morning, which prevented our setting off until 8 a.m. We left all the provisions and many other things in cache, and Mr. Stuart and I embarked in one canoe, with 4 common men and La Malice, with only the goods that will be necessary to be left at Trout Lake, and such of our other things as will be required. The reason of our leaving the remainder of the goods in cache is that we are to return as soon as we can get 2 canoes made, the eastern branch being our route to the carriers, and it has become a work of necessity to get new canoes made, the old ones being so much worn and shattered as not to be able to proceed farther. The small river is still more hard to ascend than the other, the current being much more strong. On crossing the small lake, which is upwards of 2 miles long, we perceived an Indian canoe near the east shore, but it blew too hard for them to come to us, and we were in too much hurry to go to them. From there we found several lines set along the river, which had been set in the morning. We visited them all and took 2 trouts, which made an excellent supper. We encamped upon a bank of gravel about 2 miles below the fort, but Mr. Stuart's compass having got wet, it is out of order, and he does not take the courses, but the distance from the cache to our encampment may be about 20 miles, of which the small lake is upwards of 2 miles. Saturday, June 7th, we set off at sunrise, but after Wards put ashore to dry ourselves and prepare our arms, and while we were on shore, the Montagne de Bout and Little Heads in Taboto came up with us in 2 pine canoes with their families. It was them we saw yesterday in crossing the little lake. They informed us that Mr. MacDougall was at the house alone with only an Indian, and that Blay was gone to the Carp Lake, but that he was expected back today. We arrived at the house between 10 and 11 a.m. Mr. MacDougall has been anxiously waiting for us these several days. He informed us that several of the carriers are daily expected here, and that all the Indians of this place are at the Carp Lake, where there are immense numbers of fish of the carp kind, and that there is no fish caught in this lake excepting a very few carp, on account of the water being too high, notwithstanding which we are determined to feed all hands with fish, while we remain here making canoes, and for that purpose began immediately to prepare the nets. Mr. Stuart, being the most expert hand at mending, he mended them all, and Saucier and the others set 6, and the Indians set some also. Sent Lagarde with an Indian in a pine canoe to the cache near the confluence of the Pack River to tell the people that are there what pieces they are to bring up. The Indian is to come up with the people in the large canoe tomorrow, and Lagarde is to remain there to take care of the pieces, and that he may not touch the provisions. He had the value of 4 measures ammunition to hunt for himself, there being plenty of gibier thereabout. Sent likewise Mr. MacDougall and Wananshish to the Carp Lake to desire the big men, Indians of this place, to come here with loads of fish, and to conduct the carriers here should they have arrived there. The old Barbarian arrived soon after ourselves. He brought a few furs and carpe.